On this issue, all the forces, both of the government and the opposition, fought their concluding duel, in which were involved all the other basal issues that had distracted the country since 1862. Naturally, there was a bewildering crisscross of political motives. There were men who, like Smith and Lee, would go along with the government on emancipation, provided it was to be carried out by the free will of the states. There were others who preferred subjugation to the arming of the slaves, and among these there were clashings of motive. Then, too, there were those who were willing to arm the slaves, but were resolved not to give them their freedom. The debate brings to the front of the political stage the figure of R.M.T. Hunter. Hitherto his part has not been conspicuous either as Secretary of State or as Senator from Virginia. He now becomes, in the words of Davis, a chief obstacle to the passage of the Senate bill, which would have authorized a levy of Negro troops and provided for their manumissions by the War Department with the consent of the state in which they should be at the time of the proposed manumission. After long discussions, this bill was indefinitely postponed. Meanwhile, a very different bill had dragged through the House. While it was under debate, another appeal was made to Lee. Barksdale, who came as near as anyone to being the leader of the administration, sought Lee's aid. Again, the general urged the enrollment of Negro soldiers and their eventual manumissions, but added this immensely significant proviso: I have no doubt that if Congress would authorize the Negroes, reception into service and empower the President to call upon individuals or states, for such as they are willing, to contribute, with the condition of emancipation to all enrolled, a sufficient number would be forthcoming to enable us to try the experiment for determining whether the slaves would make good soldiers. If it proved successful, most of the objections to the measure would disappear, and if individuals still remained unwilling to send their Negroes to the army, the force of public opinion in the states would soon bring about such legislation as would remove all obstacles. I think the matter should be left as far as possible to the people and to the states, which alone can legislate as the necessities of this particular service may require. The fact that Congress had before it this advice from Lee explains why all factions accepted a compromise bill passed on the 9th of March, approved by the President on the 13th of March, and issued to the country in a general order on the 23rd of March. It empowered the President to ask for and accept from the owners of slaves the service of such number of Negroes as he saw fit, and if sufficient number were not offered, to call on each state for her quota of 300,000 troops, to be raised from such classes of the population, irrespective of color, in each state as the proper authorities therefore may determine. However, nothing in this act shall be construed to authorize a change in the relation which the said slaves shall bear toward their owners, except by consent of the owners and of the states in which they may reside, and in pursuance of the laws thereof. The results of this act were negligible. Its failure to offer the slave soldier his freedom was at once seized upon by critics as evidence of the futility of the course of the administration. The sneer went round that the Negro was to be made to fight for his own captivity. Pollard, whose words, however, must be taken with a grain of salt, has left this account of recruiting under the new act. 2 companies of blacks organized from some Negro vagabonds in Richmond were allowed to give balls at the Libby prison and were exhibited in fine fresh uniforms on Capitol Square as decoys to obtain recruits. But the mass of their colored brethren looked on the parade with unenvious eyes, and little boys exhibited the early prejudice of race by pelting the fine uniforms with mud. Nevertheless, both Davis and Lee busied themselves in the endeavor to raise black troops. Governor Smith cooperated with them, and in the mind of the President there was no abandonment of the program of emancipation, which was now his cardinal policy. Soon after the passage of the act, he wrote to Smith, "I am happy to receive your assurance of success in raising black troops, as well as your promise to seek legislation to secure unmistakable freedom to the slave who shall enter the army, with a right to return to his old home when he shall have been honorably discharged from military service." While this final controversy was being fought out in Congress, the enthusiasm for the administration had again ebbed. Its recovery of prestige had run a brief course and was gone, and now in the midst of the discussion over the Negro Soldiers' Bill, the opposition once more attacked the cabinet with its old enemy, Benjamin, as the target. Resolutions were introduced into the Senate declaring that the retirement of the Honorable Judith P. Benjamin from the State Department will be subservient of the public interest. In the House, resolutions were offered describing his public utterances as derogatory to his position as a high public functionary of the Confederate government, a reflection on the motives of Congress as a deliberative body, and an insult to public opinion. So Congress wrangled and delayed while the wave of fire that was Sherman's advance moved northward through the Carolinas. Columbia had gone up in smoke while the Senate debated day after day, 15 in all, what to do with the compromise bill sent up to it from the House. It was during this period that a new complication appears to have been added to a situation which was already so hopelessly entangled, for this was the time when Governor McGrath made a proposal to Governor Vance for a league within the Confederacy, given as his chief reason that Virginia's interests were parting company with those of the Lower South. The same doubt of the Upper South appears at various times in the Mercury. And though all the tactics of the opposition runs the constant effort to discredit Davis, the Mercury scoffed at the agitation for Negro soldiers as a mad attempt on the part of the administration to remedy its myriad of previous blunders. In these terrible days the mind of Davis hardened. He became possessed by a lofty and intolerant confidence, an absolute conviction that, in spite of all appearances, he was on the threshold of success. We may safely ascribe to him, in these days, that illusory state of mind which has characterized some of the greatest of men in their overstrained concluding periods. His extraordinary promise in his latter messages, a series of vain prophecies beginning with his speech at the African Church, remind one of Napoleon after refusing the Rhine as a boundary. His nerves, too, were all but at the breaking point. He sent the Senate a scolding message because of its delay in passing the Negro Soldiers Bill. The Senate answered in a report that was sharply critical of his own course. Shortly afterward, Congress adjourned, refusing his request for another suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Davis had hinted at important matters he hoped soon to be able to submit to Congress. What he had in mind was the last, the boldest stroke of this period of desperation. The policy of emancipation he and Benjamin had accepted without reserve. They had at last perceived too late the power of the anti-slavery movement in Europe. Though they had already failed to coerce England through Cotton and had been played with and abandoned by Napoleon, they persisted in thinking that there was still a chance for a third chapter in their foreign affairs.